Before we begin this touching story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you'll never miss stories that remind us of the beauty and kindness still present in our world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corridors of St. Mary's Hospital in London. Jessica Redcliffe lay in her bed on the 4th floor, her frail hands resting on the white sheets that seemed to blend with her pale skin. At 78 years old, she had lived a full life, but now that life was drawing to a close, the doctors had given her weeks, maybe days. Her heart was failing. There was nothing more they could do except keep her comfortable. Jessica had been a teacher for 40 years. She had taught history to hundreds of students, instilling in them a love for the past and the stories of those who came before. Her classroom walls had been covered with pictures of historical figures, maps of ancient empires, and timelines that stretched across entire walls. She had a particular fondness for the British monarchy and the tradition of the Royal Guard. Every year, she would take her students on a field trip to Buckingham Palace, where they would watch the changing of the guard ceremony. The precision, the discipline, the unwavering dedication of those soldiers had always moved her deeply now. As she lay in her hospital bed, Jessica found herself thinking about those visits. She remembered the excited faces of her students, the way their eyes would widen as the guards marched past in their distinctive red tunics and bearskin hats. She remembered explaining to them how these soldiers were not just for show, but were highly trained members of the British Army who served with honor and distinction. Those memories brought a smile to her weathered face. Even as pain coursed through her body, Jessica's daughter, Margaret, sat beside her bed, holding her mother's hand. Margaret was 52, a nurse at another hospital across town, but she had taken leave to be with her mother during these final days. She watched as her mother's breathing became more labored, as the machines beside the bed beeped their steady rhythm. Monitoring a heart that was growing weaker by the hour, Margaret knew her mother had no regrets about her life. Jessica had been widowed 20 years earlier, when Margaret's father, Thomas, had passed away from cancer. She had grieved deeply, but had thrown herself into her teaching with renewed passion, finding purpose in shaping young minds. She had traveled when she could, visiting historical sites across Europe. She had volunteered at her local community center teaching history classes to adults who wanted to learn. She had lived fully and loved deeply. But there was one thing Jessica had mentioned several times in recent weeks. As her mind wandered between past and present, between waking and sleeping, she would sometimes talk about wanting to see a royal guard one more time. Not on television, not in a photograph, but in person. She wanted to see that symbol of tradition and dedication that had meant so much to her throughout her teaching career. She wanted to feel that connection to history one last time. Margaret had initially thought it was just the medication talking, morphine causing her mother to drift into confused wishes. But Jessica brought it up again and again during her clearer moments. She would ask Margaret if it would be possible if there was any way to see a royal guard before she passed. Margaret's heart broke each time her mother asked. How could she possibly arrange such a thing? Her mother was too weak to leave the hospital. She could barely sit up in bed without assistance. The idea of transporting her to Buckingham Palace was impossible. Still, Margaret couldn't shake the wish from her mind. She found herself thinking about it during her long vigils at her mother's bedside. She thought about it when she went to the hospital cafeteria for coffee. She thought about it when she returned to her mother's small flat to pick up fresh clothes and personal items. Her mother had given her so much throughout her life. Jessica had worked 2 jobs to put Margaret through nursing school after Thomas died. She had been there for every important moment in Margaret's life, every triumph and every setback. Surely Margaret could find a way to fulfill this one final wish. One evening, as Margaret sat in the uncomfortable visitor's chair beside her mother's bed, she pulled out her phone. She wasn't sure where to start, but she knew she had to try. She began searching online for any way to contact someone connected to the Royal Guard. She found official websites, phone numbers for various military offices, and email addresses that might or might not reach anyone who could help. The task felt overwhelming, and Margaret felt foolish for even attempting it. What were the chances that anyone would respond to a request from a stranger asking for such an unusual favor? But then she thought of her mother's face. The way it lit up whenever she talked about the Royal Guard ceremonies she had attended over the years. She thought about all the students her mother had inspired, all the lives she had touched through her teaching. She thought about the fact that her mother had perhaps only days left, and this was the one thing she wanted more than anything else in the world. Margaret began writing emails. She composed message after message, explaining her mother's situation, her love for British history and tradition, and her final wish. She sent emails to military offices, to the Ministry of Defense, to anyone she could find who might have even the slightest connection to the Royal Guard. She explained that her mother was dying, that time was running out, and that this would mean the world to her. She didn't expect responses. She didn't dare hope, but she had to try. For her mother, she had to try everything. 3 days passed after Margaret sent her emails. 3 long days during which her mother's condition continued to deteriorate. Jessica slept more and more, her waking periods becoming shorter and less coherent. The doctors had increased her pain medication, which helped keep her comfortable, but also made her drowsy. Margaret sat beside her mother's bed, reading aloud from Jessica's favorite history books, hoping her mother could hear her voice. Even when she seemed to be sleeping, Margaret had almost given up hope of receiving any response to her emails. She had checked her phone obsessively for the first day, jumping at every notification. By the second day, she had resigned herself to the fact that her request had been too unusual, too difficult to accommodate. Government offices and military organizations had protocols and procedures. They couldn't just send a royal guard to a hospital because a dying woman wanted to see one. Margaret understood this, even as her heart ached for her mother. On the third day, Margaret's phone buzzed while she was helping a nurse adjust her mother's pillows. She glanced at the screen and saw an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Regarding your mother's wish." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the message. It was from a Lieutenant Colonel David Harrison at the Ministry of Defense. He had received her email through several forwarded channels, and he wanted to speak with her about her mother's situation. Margaret stepped into the hallway and called the number provided in the email. Her heart pounded as the phone rang. When Lieutenant Colonel Harrison answered, his voice was warm and kind. He asked about Jessica, about her condition, about her connection to the Royal Guard. Margaret found herself pouring out the story, explaining how her mother had dedicated her life to teaching history, how she had taken countless students to see the changing of the Guard, how this ceremony and these soldiers had represented something profound to her about duty, honor, and tradition. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, there was a brief pause. Then he said something that made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. He told her that he had read her email carefully, that he had been moved by her mother's story, and that he wanted to help. He explained that while it was highly unusual, he believed they could arrange for a member of the Royal Guard to visit Jessica at the hospital. He would need to make some calls, get proper approvals, and coordinate schedules. But he would do everything in his power to make this happen. Margaret could barely speak. She thanked him repeatedly, her voice breaking with emotion. The lieutenant colonel assured her that he would call her back within a few hours with more information. When Margaret returned to her mother's room, she found Jessica awake, looking at her with curious eyes. Margaret sat down beside her and took her mother's hand. She told her that something wonderful might be happening, that someone was trying to help fulfill her wish. Jessica's eyes brightened, and she squeezed her daughter's hand weakly. True to his word, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison called back that evening. He had coordinated with several offices and had received approval for the visit. A serving member of the Queen's Guard would visit Jessica at the hospital the following afternoon. The guard's name was Lance Corporal James Mitchell, and he had volunteered for this special duty when he heard about Jessica's story. He would come in his full ceremonial uniform, complete with the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat. The lieutenant colonel emphasized that this was an exceptional circumstance, arranged because of Jessica's lifetime of service to education and her deep respect for military tradition. Margaret spent that evening preparing her mother. She told her what was going to happen, made sure Jessica understood that a real royal guard was coming to see her. Jessica became more alert than she had been in days. She asked Margaret to help her look presentable. Together, they combed Jessica's thin white hair. Margaret helped her mother put on a clean nightgown and adjusted the pillows so Jessica could sit up more comfortably. The nursing staff, who had been informed of the upcoming visit, were excited and moved by the gesture. They made sure Jessica's room was tidy and that she would be as comfortable as possible for the visit. That night, Jessica slept better than she had in weeks. Margaret dozed in the chair beside her mother's bed, waking every hour or so to check on her. In the early morning hours, when the hospital was quiet except for the distant sounds of monitors and footsteps in the corridor, Margaret watched her mother's face. Even in sleep, there seemed to be a peacefulness there that hadn't been present before. Her mother had something to look forward to, something to hold on to for just a little while longer. The next morning arrived with bright sunshine streaming through the hospital room. The nurses came in to check Jessica's vital signs and help her with breakfast. Jessica ate more than she had in days, managing several spoonfuls of porridge and half a cup of tea. She seemed determined to have as much strength as possible for the afternoon visit. Margaret helped her mother freshen up again, making sure everything was just right as the afternoon approached. Word had spread through the hospital about the special visitor who was coming. Several nurses and staff members found reasons to be near Jessica's room. The hospital administrator, Mrs. Patricia Walsh, came by to meet Margaret and express her support for what was happening. She told Margaret that in all her years working at St. Mary's, she had never seen anything quite like this. It reminded everyone why they had gone into healthcare in the first place. To provide not just medical care, but compassion and humanity. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison arrived at the hospital. He was in his regular military uniform, not the ceremonial guard uniform. He came to Jessica's room first, to introduce himself and prepare her for Lance Corporal Mitchell's arrival. He sat beside Jessica's bed and spoke to her with great respect and kindness. He told her that he had read about her career as a teacher, about the hundreds of students she had inspired over the years. He said that people like her dedicated their lives to education and to teaching young people about history and tradition, were the reason those traditions continued to matter and be preserved. Jessica listened to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Her voice was weak, but she managed to thank him for making this possible. She told him that she had never expected such kindness, that she had thought her wish was just a silly dream of an old woman. The lieutenant colonel shook his head firmly. He told her that her wish wasn't silly at all. It represented something beautiful about the human spirit and our connection to tradition and meaning. He explained that Lance Corporal Mitchell would be arriving in about 30 minutes, and that he would be in full ceremonial dress. Margaret stood by the window. Watching the exchange between her mother and the lieutenant colonel, she had been skeptical when she first sent those emails, unsure if anyone would even read them, let alone respond. Now, seeing this high-ranking military officer sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, treating her with such respect and dignity, Margaret felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This was more than she had ever hoped for. This was a demonstration of compassion that went beyond duty or obligation. This was humanity at its finest. After Lieutenant Colonel Harrison left to meet Lance Corporal Mitchell downstairs, the hospital room fell into an expectant silence. Jessica lay against her pillows, her breathing labored, but her eyes bright with anticipation. Margaret held her mother's hand, feeling the fragile bones beneath the papery skin. The machines beside the bed continued their steady beeping, marking time in a life that was measured now in moments rather than years. Outside in the corridor, nurses and staff members had gathered at a respectful distance. Word had spread throughout the entire floor about what was happening. Even patients who were well enough to leave their rooms had positioned themselves, where they might catch a glimpse of the royal guard. There was something about this gesture, about the military reaching out to fulfill an elderly teacher's final wish, that had touched everyone who heard about it. At precisely 2:30 in the afternoon, the elevator doors on the 4th floor opened. Lance Corporal James Mitchell stepped out, and there was an audible gasp from everyone in the corridor. He was in full Queen's Guard ceremonial uniform. The bright red tunic with its gold buttons gleamed under the fluorescent hospital lights. The dark blue trousers had a perfect crease down each leg. White gloves covered his hands, and polished black boots reflected the light with each measured step. Most striking of all was the bearskin hat, standing nearly 18 inches tall. Adding to his already impressive height, Lance Corporal Mitchell moved with the same precise, measured pace that royal guards used during ceremonies at Buckingham Palace. His face was composed and serious, embodying the discipline and dedication that Jessica had so admired throughout her life. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison walked beside him, guiding him toward Jessica's room. The corridor had fallen completely silent except for the sound of Mitchell's boots on the linoleum floor. When they reached Jessica's room, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison entered first. He approached Jessica's bed and spoke softly. He told her that Lance Corporal Mitchell had arrived and asked if she was ready to meet him. Jessica nodded, unable to speak, her eyes already filling with fresh tears. Margaret squeezed her mother's hand and moved slightly to the side to give them room. Lance Corporal Mitchell entered the room with slow, deliberate steps. Despite the cramped hospital space, he maintained the formal bearing of his position. He stopped at the foot of Jessica's bed and came to attention with a precision that would have been perfect on any parade ground. For a long moment, he stood there in silence, allowing Jessica to take in every detail of the uniform she had admired for so many years. Jessica stared at him with wonder in her eyes. Her breath caught, and tears flowed freely down her face. This was the image she had carried in her heart throughout her teaching career, the symbol of tradition and dedication that had meant so much to her. And now, impossibly, unbelievably, a royal guard stood in her hospital room, his presence transforming the sterile medical space into something sacred. Then Lance Corporal Mitchell did something unexpected. While royal guards on duty at Buckingham Palace are famous for their stoic immobility, refusing to react to tourists or distractions, Mitchell was not on ceremonial guard duty at this moment. He was here as an act of compassion and respect. Slowly, with great dignity, he removed his bearskin hat and tucked it under his left arm in the traditional manner. Then he took several steps closer to Jessica's bed. His face, now visible, showed a young man in his mid-20s with kind eyes and a gentle expression. He looked at Jessica with genuine warmth and respect. In a clear, strong voice, he spoke directly to her. He told her his name and said it was an honor to meet her. He explained that he had been briefed about her career as a teacher, about her dedication to educating young people about history and tradition. He said that people like her were the reason traditions like the Royal Guard continued to have meaning and relevance in the modern world. Jessica tried to speak but couldn't find the words. Her emotions overwhelmed her. She reached out a trembling hand toward Mitchell, and he immediately understood. He stepped closer to the bed and gently took her hand in his white-gloved one. He held it carefully, mindful of how fragile she was. He continued speaking, telling her about his own service, about what it meant to him to be part of the Royal Guard, about the pride he felt in representing centuries of military tradition. Margaret watched this exchange through her own tears. She saw her mother's face transformed with joy and peace. The pain that had been etched there for weeks seemed to fade away, replaced by something luminous and beautiful. Her mother was experiencing a moment of pure happiness, a connection to something she had valued her entire life. Margaret pulled out her phone and, with a questioning glance at Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who nodded his approval, began taking photographs of this extraordinary moment. Lance Corporal Mitchell continued to hold Jessica's hand as he spoke to her. He asked her about her teaching career, and Jessica, finding her voice again, began to tell him stories. Her words came slowly, interrupted by pauses to catch her breath, but she was determined to share. She told him about the first time she had taken students to see the changing of the guard, how nervous she had been that the children would misbehave or not appreciate what they were seeing. Instead, they had been mesmerized, completely silent and respectful throughout the entire ceremony. Mitchell listened attentively, his expression showing genuine interest in every word Jessica said. He asked her questions, encouraging her to share more memories. Jessica told him about a student named Robert who had been struggling in school, getting into trouble and seeming to lack direction. After that first trip to Buckingham Palace, Robert had become fascinated with military history. He had started studying harder, paying attention in class, asking Jessica for extra books to read. Years later, Bart had joined the army himself and had sent Jessica a letter thanking her for showing him a path forward in life. As Jessica spoke, her voice grew slightly stronger. She seemed energized by the conversation, by the opportunity to share these memories with someone who understood their significance. Mitchell told her that he had heard similar stories from his own teachers, about how a single experience or moment of inspiration could change the direction of a young person's life. He said that teachers like Jessica were force multipliers, that their influence extended far beyond the classroom and touched countless lives in ways they might never fully know. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, standing quietly near the door, watched this interaction with deep emotion. He had been in the military for over 20 years, had served in combat zones, had experienced countless moments of courage and camaraderie. But this simple act of kindness, this young soldier bringing joy to a dying woman, moved him profoundly. This was what service was really about, he thought. Not just the battles and ceremonies, but the human connections. The moments of compassion that reminded everyone why traditions and institutions mattered in the first place. Margaret captured the scene with her phone, taking photographs and short videos. She knew her mother would want to remember this, and that she herself would need these images in the difficult days ahead. She recorded Mitchell talking with her mother, their hands still joined. She captured the moment when Mitchell carefully placed his bearskin hat on Jessica's lap, allowing her to touch it, to feel the texture of the fur, and understand the weight of it. Jessica ran her fingers over the hat with reverence, her face showing childlike wonder. Mitchell explained to Jessica that the bearskin hats were made from the fur of Canadian black bears and stood 18 inches tall. He told her that they dated back to the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, when British soldiers took them from defeated French Imperial Guards. The tradition had continued for over 200 years, connecting every royal guard who wore the hat to that long line of soldiers who had served before them. Jessica listened, absorbing every detail, adding to the historical knowledge she had accumulated over her lifetime. Then Mitchell did something even more remarkable. He asked Jessica if she would like to try on the hat. Jessica's eyes widened with surprise and delight. She looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly, then back at Mitchell. She said she would be honored, but worried she might not be strong enough to hold it. Mitchell assured her he would help. Carefully, with Margaret supporting her mother from one side and Mitchell from the other, they helped Jessica sit up a bit straighter. Then Mitchell gently placed the bearskin hat on Jessica's head. The hat was enormous on her small frame, dwarfing her delicate features. But the expression on Jessica's face was priceless. She looked like a young girl on Christmas morning, filled with pure joy and excitement. Mitchell stepped back and, with complete seriousness, saluted her. He told her she wore it with great honor and distinction. Jessica laughed, a sound Margaret hadn't heard from her mother in months. It was a weak laugh, cut short by her labored breathing. But it was genuine and full of happiness. A nurse who had been standing quietly in the doorway wiped tears from her eyes. She had seen many patients in the final stages of life, had witnessed countless goodbyes and final moments. But she had never seen anything quite like this, had never seen someone so close to death suddenly radiate such life and joy. It reminded her why she had become a nurse, why she endured the long hours and emotional difficulty of her work. Moments like this made everything worthwhile. After a few minutes, Mitchell carefully removed the hat from Jessica's head and helped her settle back against her pillows. She was exhausted from the effort of sitting up, but her face glowed with satisfaction. Mitchell set his hat aside for a moment and pulled up a chair beside Jessica's bed. He continued talking with her, asking about other memories from her teaching career, about the students who had made the biggest impressions on her, about what had drawn her to teaching history in the first place. Jessica told him about her own grandfather, who had served in World War II. He had been a quiet man who rarely spoke about his experiences. But occasionally, he would tell young Jessica stories about the war, about the importance of duty and sacrifice, about the bonds between soldiers. Those stories had sparked Jessica's lifelong interest in military history and tradition. She had wanted to pass that appreciation on to her students, to help them understand that history wasn't just dates and names in a textbook, but real people who had lived and struggled and persevered. Mitchell shared his own family's military history. His great-grandfather had served in World War I, his grandfather in World War II. and his father in the Falklands War, joining the army and eventually becoming part of the Royal Guard had been his way of honoring that legacy. He told Jessica that standing guard at Buckingham Palace was one of the greatest privileges of his life, that he never took for granted the responsibility of representing his country and his regiment in such a visible way. As Jessica and Lance Corporal Mitchell talked, time seemed to slow down in that hospital room. The harsh realities of illness and approaching death receded, replaced by a sense of connection and shared purpose. Here was a young soldier and an elderly teacher, separated by generations, but united by their respect for tradition, history, and service to others. Their conversation ranged across topics from military history to teaching philosophy to the importance of ceremony and ritual, giving structure and meaning to human life. Mitchell told Jessica about his training to become a Royal Guard, about the months of preparation required before a soldier could stand post at Buckingham Palace. He explained that it wasn't just about looking impressive in the uniform. Royal Guards were fully operational soldiers, often having served in combat deployments before being selected for ceremonial duties. They underwent rigorous training in drill movements, weapon handling, and protocol. They had to memorize countless procedures and maintain absolute discipline regardless of weather conditions or distractions from tourists. Jessica listened with rapt attention. She had always known that the Royal Guards were serious soldiers, not just ceremonial figures. But hearing these details from someone who lived that reality added depth to her understanding. She asked Mitchell about the most challenging part of standing guard. He thought for a moment before answering. He told her it was maintaining focus during the long hours of remaining motionless, especially in extreme weather. He had stood post, in freezing winter rain and blazing summer heat, never breaking his stance, never showing discomfort. But Mitchell said the physical challenges weren't really the hardest part. The hardest part was living up to the responsibility of the uniform. When he stood guard at Buckingham Palace, he represented not just himself or even his regiment, but the entire British Army and, in a way, the nation itself. Tourists from around the world came to see the guards, and many of them had very little other exposure to British military tradition. Mitchell knew that his conduct, his bearing, his absolute professionalism would shape how those people viewed his country and its armed forces. That was a weight he carried every time he put on the uniform. Jessica nodded, understanding completely. She told Mitchell that she had felt something similar as a teacher. Every day in the classroom, she represented education itself to her students. For some children, especially those from difficult backgrounds, she might be their only positive adult role model. The way she conducted herself, the passion she showed for learning, the respect she gave to each student, regardless of their background or ability, all of it mattered profoundly. She had never taken that responsibility lightly. Margaret listened to this conversation between her mother and the young soldier with a sense of wonder. She was witnessing something rare and precious. Two people from different generations and different walks of life were connecting on a fundamental level, recognizing in each other a shared commitment to something larger than themselves. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time, because Margaret knew that this conversation, this perfect moment, was happening in the shadow of her mother's approaching death. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had been standing respectfully near the doorway, checked his watch. Mitchell had been with Jessica for nearly an hour, far longer than they had initially planned. But Harrison made no move to interrupt. He could see how much this meant to both Jessica and Mitchell. Some things were more important than schedules and protocols. This was one of those things. Outside in the corridor, the gathering of nurses and staff had grown larger. Other patients had joined them, some in wheelchairs, others leaning on walkers or forepoles. Word had spread through multiple floors of the hospital about the Royal Guard visiting a dying teacher. People who were themselves dealing with illness and fear and uncertainty found comfort in witnessing this act of kindness. It reminded them that compassion and humanity still existed in the world, that institutions and individuals could reach beyond their normal boundaries to bring joy to someone in need. One elderly patient, a man named Arthur who was recovering from hip surgery, stood in the corridor with tears streaming down his face. He was a veteran himself, had served in the army in the 1960s. Seeing a young soldier in full ceremonial uniform, taking time to honor a civilian who had dedicated her life to teaching young people about military tradition, moved him deeply. He told the nurse standing beside him that this was what service was really about. This was the kind of thing that made him proud to have worn the uniform. Inside Jessica's room, Mitchell was preparing to leave. He had received a subtle signal from Lieutenant Colonel Harrison that it was time, but before he stood up, he reached into his tunic and pulled out something unexpected. It was a small insignia pin, the badge of his regiment. He explained to Jessica that this pin was given to soldiers when they completed their training and officially joined the regiment. It wasn't something that was supposed to be given away, but Mitchell wanted Jessica to have it. He told her that teachers like her had inspired countless young people to serve, and that she deserved to carry a piece of that service with her. Jessica accepted the pin with trembling hands. She looked at it through her tears, then looked up at Mitchell with an expression of profound gratitude. She tried to thank him, but her voice failed her. Mitchell understood without words. He gently squeezed her hand one final time, then stood up. He carefully positioned his bearskin hat back on his head, adjusting it to the perfect angle. Then he came to attention beside Jessica's bed. In a clear, formal voice, Mitchell addressed Jessica one last time. He thanked her for her lifetime of service to education and to preserving respect for military tradition. He told her that soldiers like him could only do their duty because people like her ensured that the next generation understood why that duty mattered. He said it had been his great honor to meet her, that he would carry the memory of this meeting with him throughout his service. Then he rendered a perfect military salute. Holding it for several seconds while Jessica watched through her tears, Mitchell turned with parade ground precision and walked toward the door. As he passed Margaret, he paused briefly. He told her, quietly, that her mother was an extraordinary woman and that Margaret should be very proud of her. Margaret nodded, unable to speak, and watched as Mitchell walked out into the corridor. The gathered crowd of hospital staff and patients spontaneously began to applaud. Mitchell maintained his formal bearing, but a slight smile touched his lips as he walked toward the elevator. After Lance Corporal Mitchell departed, the hospital room fell into a profound silence. Jessica lay against her pillows, clutching the regiment pin in her hand, tears still flowing down her face. But these were not tears of sadness or pain. These were tears of fulfillment, of gratitude, of having experienced something beautiful beyond her wildest expectations. Margaret sat beside her mother, holding her other hand, both of them processing what had just happened. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison remained for a few more minutes. He sat down in the chair Mitchell had vacated and spoke softly to Jessica. He told her that Mitchell had been genuinely honored to meet her, that it hadn't been a duty or obligation, but something Mitchell had wanted to do from the moment he heard her story. Harrison explained that the young soldier had volunteered immediately when asked, that he had taken extra time to ensure his uniform was absolutely perfect, that he had read the information about Jessica's teaching career carefully before coming so he would understand what this meant to her. Jessica found her voice again, weak but clear. She thanked Harrison for making this possible, for seeing her request not as a foolish whim but as something worthy of respect and attention. Harrison shook his head gently. He told her there was nothing foolish about wanting to connect with something meaningful at the end of life. He said that her wish had given many people, including himself and Mitchell, an opportunity to participate in something profoundly human and good. If anything, they should be thanking her for reminding them why they served in the first place. Before Harrison left, he gave Margaret his contact information. He told her to reach out if there was anything else her mother needed, anything at all. He also mentioned that the Ministry of Defense would like to document this visit if the family was comfortable with that, perhaps writing about it in military publications to highlight the connection between service members and the communities they protect. Margaret said she would think about it and discuss it with her mother, but she appreciated the offer. After Harrison departed, the nursing staff came in to check on Jessica. They found her vitals had actually improved slightly. Her heart rate was more stable than it had been in days, and her breathing, while still labored, seemed less distressed. The head nurse, a woman named Claire, who had worked at St. Mary's for 30 years, told Margaret that sometimes the spirit could affect the body in remarkable ways. Joy and peace could sometimes provide relief that medicine alone couldn't achieve. Throughout the rest of that day and into the evening, Jessica remained more alert and present than she had been in weeks. She asked Margaret to help her look at the photos and videos from Mitchell's visit. They watched them together repeatedly, Jessica pointing out details she wanted to remember, asking Margaret to tell her what people had said in the corridor, wanting to know every aspect of what had happened. The regiment pin remained clutched in her hand, and she refused to let anyone take it from her. Even when the nurses needed to examine her, that evening, former students began to arrive at the hospital. Word had spread through social media and local news about Jessica's visit from the Royal Guard, people who had been in her classes decades earlier, many now middle-aged with children of their own, came to pay their respects and share their memories. They brought flowers and cards. They told Margaret how much her mother had influenced their lives, how Jessica's passion for history had inspired them to pursue education or military service or simply to be better citizens. One woman named Sarah, who must have been in her 40s, told Margaret that Jessica had changed her life. Sarah had been a troubled teenager, angry at the world, and heading down a dangerous path. Jessica had taken a special interest in her, spending lunch periods tutoring her, talking with her about her problems, showing her that someone cared. Jessica had even attended Sarah's graduation from university years later, one of the few people Sarah had invited. Now Sarah was a teacher herself, working at a rough inner-city school, trying to be for her students what Jessica had been for her. Another visitor was Robert, the student Jessica had mentioned to Mitchell, the one who had joined the army after being inspired by the changing of the guard ceremony. Robert was now in his 50s, retired from military service after a distinguished career. He had heard about Jessica's condition and the special visit she had received.